Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study. My name is Matthew, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church. And as we know, every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study as we do our Bible study over these last few months. For over 30 or 40 weeks now, actually, we've been doing a series of teaching titled Journeying Through the Hebrew Bible. And we've been looking at each of the individual books of the Old Testament, what the Jews call the Hebrew Scriptures. And we're looking at the message behind each of those books and how they apply to the Christian life. We've looked at the Torah, the first 5 books of the law. We've looked at the former and the later prophets, what we call the history books and the prophets. And then recently we've been looking at the writings, books like Nehemiah, Esther, and recently, even more recently, we've been looking at the wisdom literature, which is part of the writings. And you remember that last week when we started to look at the wisdom literature, we were looking at the book of Proverbs. And we were looking at how the conduct of life, the observations of life, that if we live wisely, it will generally go well with us. But if we don't live wisely, it will generally not go well for us. And this view that good things happen to good people, or at least they should happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people, or at least they should happen to bad people, is what we call retribution theology. And that's a theology or a belief that many people hold to, even those people who will not necessarily describe themselves as Christians, or maybe sometimes in cases people who may not necessarily believe in God. They believe that if you do the right thing, generally it should go well for you, and if you do the bad things, generally it should not go so well for you. And so this notion is what we call retribution theology. And as we come into the wisdom books, like Proverbs, like Job, like Ecclesiastes, they wrestle with the question of retribution theology. And remember that last week we looked specifically at the book of Proverbs, and we saw how the book of Proverbs, in dealing with the conduct of the life, affirms this notion of retribution theology. However, every so often, things happen in life that would cause us to question whether this thing is really true. So, for example, the criminal or the seems to get off scot-free from a crime they committed, or the person who murdered someone isn't found out and they live a long life, or the innocent die in some sort of tragedy, or the farmer who works hard all his life suddenly loses his livelihood through no fault of his own. And so these things come to life often, and what they do, they bring a contradiction to this notion of retribution theology, and they cause us to question. Sometimes it causes the question God's goodness or God's power. Is God able to do good in this world? Or they cause us to question even God's existence. And many people have gone to that point where they just say that there's too much suffering in this world, there's just too much pain in this world for me to justify the believing that there is a God who exists. And what you find is that the books of Ecclesiastes and the books of Job wrestle with this question specifically. And very often what it requires when it comes to dealing with the contradictions of life, what we find is that when we try to defend God's goodness or God's power or God's existence in the face of such suffering in the world, we need what we call a theodicy. That is a rational defense of God's goodness and God's power in the face of all the problems and all the pain and the suffering that we see in the world around us. And so, as I mentioned last week, the book of Proverbs affirms retribution theology, the idea that if you live wisely, it will go well with you, and that's just an observation of life. But the books of Job and the books of Ecclesiastes wrestle with the questions that deal with the contradictions of retribution theology. So when things don't go the way that you feel that they should do or should be in this world, how do we wrestle those sort of questions? And so tonight what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at specifically the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes that wrestles with these questions. And so when we come to a book like Job, you'll be encouraged to know that the book of Job, which happens to be the oldest book of the Bible, although the stories of Genesis predate the time of Job, the book of Job itself is the oldest book in terms of the earliest book that we have written. It is dealing with an age-old question that humanity has wrestled with for centuries. If there is a God, why is there so much suffering in our world? Now, just before we kind of delve into how Job answers that question, I want to give you a bit of an outline to the book of Job, because Job could be divided into three parts. The first part is a prologue that is written in prose. And what this does, it sets the literary framework to the whole book of Job. And what it shows is that it depicts the fact that there's a man called Job who lives in the land of Ur, and he's a righteous man. He's a man of integrity. He has a family. He has sons. He has daughters. He's a very wealthy man. He has much cattle, and he's just a man who is an upstanding man in the community. And what there is, we then shift to heaven, and there is a wager between God and Satan. And Satan says, "I'm wandering throughout the earth, seeking to bring menace in the earth, as it were." But God says something interesting to Job, and God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And God boasts of Job, and God says there's no one like Job, a man of incredible integrity. And Satan can't believe that anyone would be good for goodness sake. He thinks that you can only be good if you're going to get something out of it. So, for example, you can only be good if you're going to get good health out of it, if you're going to get a family out of it, or wealth or power out of it. In other words, this notion of retribution theology, that if you do the good thing, good things will happen to you. And so Satan can't believe that anyone would seek to do what's right just for the sake of doing what's right. And God says, well, you know what? I bet you're wrong, Satan, on that. And Satan says, no, I bet you're wrong, God. And so there's a wager between God and Satan, and God allows Satan to bring harm to the life of Job. God allows Satan to take his wealth. He loses his wealth in one day, and God allows Satan to take his family. And then eventually God allows Satan even to take Job's health. And yet in the midst of all of this, Job is still faithful to God. And so God wins the wager in many ways. So that's the first part. The second part is really the discourse, the dialogue that Job has with his friends and with God. And this part is written in poetry. So the first part is in prose. The second part is in poetry. And we see this dialogue. We see this dialogue in two parts. The first part is the dialogue between Job and his friends. And so Job is engaging in a dialogue with his so-called friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they're trying to give him advice as to why he is suffering. And to be honest with you, they are miserable comforters. They're not the people that you want in your life when you're going through pain. And effectively, they are saying to Job, Job, the reason why all this wrong has happened to your life is because you have not been faithful to God. You have been unfaithful. And Job obviously contests that. And in fact, there's an amazing chapter towards the end in Job 28 on wisdom. And Job gives us an amazing discourse on what wisdom is. And then towards the end, there's another young man by the name of Elihu who puts his word in the discourse, as it were, but Job doesn't really respond to that. And so what we see is that there are three sets of discourses between Job and his three friends, and there's this kind of dialogue that is going on of this wrestling with this issue as to why Job is suffering the way that he is suffering. But then the final part of the poetic part of Job is this divine dialogue between God and Job. And this is where God addresses Job in his suffering. And then when we close the book of Job, we've got another epilogue, which is in prose. And in this part of Job, we see that God heals Job, God restores Job, God gives back Job twice as much as he had to start off with. And the whole point of this story is that Job is completely unaware that the reason why he is going through the suffering that he's going through is because there's a wager between God and Satan. He's not even aware of this. And so at no point does Job get the answer to his questions. But nevertheless, he finishes off in a better place than he started. And so the book of Job deals with the contradictions of life. It deals, why is it that there is suffering in this world to those, even to the innocent? And so many scholars, and I would agree, that the book of Job really is a masterpiece of ancient Near Eastern literature. And so the question we got to ask when we come to a book of Job is it a work of fiction, or is it a fact? Is it something that actually happened? Well, when you read the story of Job, you'll notice that you're taken in different locations. You're taken to heaven, then you're taken to earth. And sometimes it would almost seem a little bit difficult that there was someone there writing down these poetic discourses as Job and his friends are dialoguing. And so it would seem that the book is a book of fiction. However, the rest of the Bible, throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, all regard Job as a real historical figure, as someone who actually lived and someone who went through this experience as described in the book of Job. And so many think actually the book of Job isn't a work of fiction, neither is a work of fact, as it were, a factual book. It's actually what we call a work of faction. In other words, it is a play, as it were, an inspired play by the Holy Spirit, based upon a real historical figure of someone who actually lived, a man by the name of Job, who came from this land, a place called Ur, I think it was, okay, off the top of my head, or I probably haven't got that right, but of this unusual part of the world, anyway, Uz, I think it was, the land of Uz. And so what we see then, as we look at this book, we know that this book is an incredibly old book, because when it talks about Job, it doesn't talk about his wealth in terms of silver or gold or shekels that he had. There's no reference that's made to kings at the time. And so there's no reference to the Mosaic law. And so this would suggest that this is quite an old book. In fact, some of the Hebrew words in this book are some of the oldest known Hebrew words. And so most scholars would say that this book was written about 900 years before the birth of Christ, but is speaking of events even before that, maybe 1,000 years before that, possibly at the time of the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it's an incredibly old book, and it is an old book that is dealing with the age-old question that is just as relevant today as it ever has been. And that question is this, that if God exists, and if God is all-powerful, and if God is good, why is there so much suffering and evil in the world? And we see suffering in the evil world. Either God is not good, he doesn't care, or God is not powerful, he's not able to deal with the problems of the world, or that God doesn't exist at all. And so what we see is that for someone to wrestle with this question, they have to hold on to this view of what we call that retribution theology. They have to believe that, good things should happen to good people and bad things should happen to bad people. And as I mentioned last week, the book of Proverbs affirms this. But when we come across these contradictions, both Job and, as we'll see in a minute, Ecclesiastes wrestle with this question, and Job in particular wrestles with this question. And what Job does is that the book of Job rebuts two false notions that we hold onto life, and we hold on to this retribution theology too rigidly. In other words, holding on to this view that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people, is a view that we have to hold on as a general principle, but not as a hard and fast rule in every situation in life. And so we hold on to that view too rigidly. It leads to two false conclusions. The first false conclusion is that the person who is suffering is bad. And that is exactly what Job's friends accused Job of. They said to Job, the reason why you are suffering the way you are is because you're not living a righteous life. In fact, as you read through the book of Job, you'll find that the criticism of Job's so-called friends gets more harsher as time goes on. In fact, they accuse him of being a wicked man, and they are horrendous, and they get harsher and harsher. And so here's poor Job. I mean, the guy's lost his family, he's lost his health, he's lost everything. He's lost his wealth, he's lost everything in his life. And the people who are meant to be his friends, the people who are meant to be bringing comfort into his life, are accusatory to him. And they're saying, Job, you are suffering because you are a wicked man. And, Job complains, Job despairs. And he says, he makes a statement actually in Job 6 verse 4 that even if a man should forsake the fear of God, he should still at least have his friends in his life and the comfort of his friends. And I think what this shows is that the last thing someone needs if their child is dying of cancer is to say, well, your child's dying of cancer because of sin. No, that's the last thing anyone needs to hear. And there is a lot of suffering that comes in this world that is not a result of sin. Yes, oftentimes, more often than not, our problems are self-inflicted. Yes, more often than not, we are a victim of our own poor choices in life. But often, at other times, that's just not the case. Sometimes we are a victim of our circumstances through no fault of our own, and we go through incredible suffering through nothing wrong that we've done. You remember the time when there was a man born blind, and the disciples asked Jesus, Lord, who sinned, this man or his parents? And the Lord said, neither of them, but this might happen that you may see the glory of God. And so it is too short-sighted and simplistic to say that someone is going through tough times in their life because of the poor choices that they've made or because of some sin in their life. And so we've got to be careful not to fall into that type of thinking. The other wrong conclusion that we can make is when we go through difficult times or we see suffering in the world is that God is unjust or impotent. In other words, that God doesn't care or that God is not able to deal with the problems of the world. And actually, this was the complaint that Job had with God. In fact, we read here that Job was even questioning, he wasn't so much questioning God's power as he was questioning God's justice when he said that if I have sinned what I have done to you, O watcher men, why have you made me your target? I mean, these are bold words for a mere mortal to speak actually against God. And it almost seems he's accusing God. And here's the remarkable thing in the midst of this. At no point does God accuse Job of blasphemy. God actually appreciates Job's real honesty of where he's at. Here is a man who's in great pain and great suffering, and God doesn't rebuke him for his he doesn't rebuke him for his accusation against the Lord. In fact, God doesn't even see it as blasphemy. Job is speaking out of his pain to God, and he's saying, God, this is how I feel towards you, and I feel, God, that you are letting me down. I feel, God, that you are, you're letting me down in the midst of the suffering that I am going through right now. And so the Job is raw and is honest, and God does not react to that. God is big enough, to get offended over comments like that. And in the midst of all of this, even though Job vents his complaint to God about how he feels he's been mistreated by God, fundamentally, Job still believes in God's goodness. He still says that though he slay me, yet still will I trust in God. And so, in response to Job's complaint that God is treating him unjustly, the Lord responds to Job right at the end of Job. And you know how God responds to Job? He doesn't answer his question, okay? God doesn't actually answer Job's question. What God says to Job is, Job, do you know how to run the universe? Do you know how to run the universe? Was you there when I created the heavens and the earth? Was you there when I created the animals and the animal kingdom? Was you there when I hold and sustained the universe? In other words, God is saying to Job, there's some answers that you will just not get the answer to this side of eternity. You're just going to have to wait until you're with me in heaven. And you're just going to have to learn to trust me in the midst of your suffering and in the midst of your pain and what you are going through. And so in the midst of all of this, God does not actually answer Job's question, but he causes him to think about, actually, Job, there are things that you will not fully grasp or understand here, because our life on earth is just a passing through. It's just a blip in the sea of eternity. And very often the things that we're going through now don't make sense, but they will make sense when we're with the Lord in heaven. And as we know, at the end of the story, we see that God is still deemed just and sovereign, and actually God restores Job in his health, and he gives him twice as much as he started. And so this is the conundrum that is wrestled with in the book of Job. And so before we look at Ecclesiastes, I think it's really just important to see that the New Testament holds Job as someone who is an example of patience in the face of suffering. And that's what we can learn from the life of Job, that we are to live our lives patiently in the face of inconvenience and setbacks and disappointments and suffering. And we're exhorted to trust God even when things don't go well. Now, this brings us to the next book of the wisdom literature, which is the book of Ecclesiastes. And in many ways, the book of Ecclesiastes is dealing with the same issue, or wrestling the same issues the book of Job is, but from a different angle and from a different perspective. As like Job, it is wrestling with the contradictions of life and the view of holding this view of retribution theology too strongly. And the key idea behind it is that, life's just meaningless. What's the point of living? Okay, you work hard, you do the right things in life, you're gonna die anyway. What's the point? And it's almost like this despairing sense of nihilist view of life. And obviously it was written by Solomon, King Solomon, probably at the end of his life, and it's written by a man who's basically depressed. Okay. Here's a guy who has everything in life. He has the wealth, he has the women, he has the power, he has everything that the carnal man could ever wish to have in life. And the guy's miserable. The guy is unhappy. He's got everything that life could ask for him, and he's empty inside. And that is the essence of Ecclesiastes. And it's wrestling with this question of, what's the point? What's the point? You try to do the right thing, you try to work hard, and you get everything, but you still feel empty. Now, there's a key phrase here, or the key, when we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, it starts off with the words of the teacher, or the Hebrew word is the kolophet. The word actually means to be a public speaker, or to be like a philosopher, to be a debater, someone who is reflecting on life and debating the meaning of life, but is almost debating it from a purely human perspective, an earthly perspective. And so if we were to break down the book of Ecclesiastes, you can break it into 3 parts. We got a title and a theme in chapters 1 to 1 verse 11. Then we got wisdom's reflections in chapter 1:12 to 4:16. And then we got admonitions and observations in chapter 5:1 to chapter 12. And we finish off with a conclusion in chapter 12. And so what happens is that the philosopher, assuming that this is Solomon, starts off with the contradictions of life. And he says that life is meaningless. Why is it that bad things happen to good people, good things happen to wicked people? And so the philosopher starts off saying that we're no better off being good than being bad. And he has this very narrow and diminished view of life. And he wonders, what's the point of living a righteous life if we all end up going to the grave? In fact, there's a common, interesting phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes where he says, even a live dog is better than a dead lion, okay? In other words, life just seems so meaningless. It just seems so pointless, what's the point? I plant vineyards. I get lots of material things. I don't deny the pleasures of life. I pursue this hedonistic lifestyle. And yet, the philosopher still says, I'm still feeling empty inside. I'm still feeling, my life still feels so broken inside. And so there's this kind of repetition to life. He says, there's nothing new under the sun. Life just goes on in this endless circle. And so he just despairs. He says that there's no satisfaction in life. In fact, he repeats the words of the great philosopher Samit Jagger when he said, I can't get no satisfaction. I just can't find the satisfaction I need in life. And so it is actually, on the surface, a very depressing book. But actually, I'm so glad that this book of Ecclesiastes is in our Bibles, because you know what? It addresses some of the most fundamental questions that we all have in life. And particularly for those people who live life with a materialistic or naturalistic or atheistic worldview. People who say that this is all there is to life. There's nothing more to it. When you're dead, you're dead. So you better make the most of this life, because when your life ends, that's it. And the view is it reduces life to this pointlessness, this meaninglessness of life. In the words of Richard Dawkins, that this is life, there's no good or bad, it's blind, pitiless indifference. And so that is the view of someone who just thinks that this is all to life. He said, that is the perspective of living your life under the sun, as it were. And in fact, that is a phrase that repeats itself again and again throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. But what you find is interesting, when you come to the end of Ecclesiastes, the philosopher, assuming that this is Solomon, realizes that actually, in the long run, it works better for the God-fearing person than for the person who just doesn't care in life. And so Solomon counsels us that the best thing that he could advise all of us to do is to remember your Creator in the days of your youth, and to remember your Creator in the days of youth, and to fear God and to follow the counsel of God in your life, because that fulfills the duty of the whole man. And at the end of the day, every deed that we do, everything we do, will be brought into judgment. Every hidden thing that we do, good or evil, will be brought to the light. And so what you see is this. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, everything is spoken of as under the sun. Everything is spoken of from a temporal, earthly perspective. That is how life is seen. That is how life is treated. But what happens at the end, Solomon almost has this change of perspective. He begins to see life from the heavenly perspective, and he realizes that when we live life purely from an earthly perspective, our lives are meaningless. They don't have any value. It seems to be of no advantage to do what the right thing is. But when we change our perspective from God's perspective, we begin to realize that actually our life does have meaning, our life has purpose, and he realizes that in the long run it goes better for the God-fearing person than for the person who doesn't fear God. And so how can we close this study tonight as we look at both of these books, the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes, that wrestles with the contradictions of life and wrestles with this whole issue? We hold too strongly to this view of retribution theology. Well, I'm going to close to you with the real words of Psalm 73, because I believe that Psalm 73 encapsulates everything that what these books are saying. Okay, and it reads as follows. It says this: surely, I think this was written by the sons of Korah, as far as I recall. Okay, surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I nearly lost my foothold, for I envy the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles in their bodies. They are healthy and strong. They are free from the common human burdens. They are not plagued by human ills. Therefore pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. From their callous hearts comes iniquity. Their evil imaginations have no limits. They scoff and speak of malice. With arrogance they threaten oppression. Their mouths lay claim to heaven, and their tongues take possession of the earth. Therefore their people turn to them, and they drink of waters in obedience. Okay? They say, how would God know? Does the Most High know anything? This is what the wicked are like, are always carefree. They go on amassing wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. All day long I have been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments. If I'd spoken out like that, I would have betrayed your children. When I tried to understand all of this, it troubled me deeply. And listen to this last verse here. Till I entered the sanctuary of God, then I understood their final destiny. And what we see in this psalm is this, and you can read the rest of the psalm at your own time, is that when the psalmist is looking at life from the earthly perspective, he envies what he sees around him. He envies the wicked. He feels envious. And obviously, envy is not a good thing. And he thinks, why are they prospering? I'm trying to do the right thing and nothing's working for me. And these guys, they don't care about God and they're prospering in life. It's the contradictions of life. But he says, when I entered the God's presence, something changed. In other words, his perspective on life changed, and he saw life from the heavenly perspective. And what I'm going to suggest for all of us here today, if we're going through a difficulty, if we're going through trials in our life, if we're going through things that don't make sense, in spite of the fact of you're trying to do the right thing, let me encourage you to come before God in the place of prayer, and let me encourage you to ask God to help you see your life from his perspective. And as you do so, I believe that will help you through the contradictions of life. However, overall, it generally works better for those who are faithful to the Lord than those who are not. And so that's our thought to think about as we close this section on the wisdom literature. And next week, we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel as we finish off our long study on the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. But our question to ponder tonight is as follows. When life feels unfair, what helps you hold onto your faith and trust that God is still good and just? So when life feels unfair, what helps you to hold onto your faith and trust that God is still good and just? And your text of study, I'd like you to read Job chapter 38, verses 1 to 7. And I'd like you to have a go at answering this question in your study tonight, in your Bible study, and that is, what tone does God use when speaking to Job? What imagery does God use to describe his creation? Why does God respond to Job with questions rather than direct answers? What does this passage reveal about God's nature compared to human understanding? And when faced with suffering or injustice, how can remembering God's greatness and wisdom help you trust him? And how can you respond when you don't get the answers you want in difficult times? If you enjoyed this tonight, guys, if you've got something out of it, why not give it a like? And why not subscribe to the channel and share it? And let's get the word out there. Hey, listen, guys, have a great evening. Looking forward to seeing you over the weekend. And looking forward to next week when we delve into the book of Daniel. God bless you all.